Thanks very much, Javid, and thanks everyone for coming. So native bees in production landscapes. This title connects to a few interests of mine. As Javid mentioned, I originally started out as an agricultural scientist and specialising in entomology. And since I've been in Tasmania, I've got to know certain aspects of the insect fauna better than others. And in the last 10 years, I've had an interest in pollination ecology, mainly mediated through a few students I've had since about 2000, I think starting with Andrew Hingston, and there's been about 4 or 5 other students since that time. So in one sense it's ironic that our School of Geography and Environmental Studies has sort of been absorbed into the School of Land and Food, because it's really back to the future for me, back to my origins. So this is a topic that I feel I can make some progress in, that is a good fit for the new school setup. So I just want to take you through the story of bees in Tasmania, starting with just what are bees. Visit this question of is there indeed a pollination crisis in the world, something we hear a bit about in the press, and to what extent is it true in Australia? What native bees occur here relative to the rest of the country? Are they such that they can be managed in any effective way? And following on from that, is there a potential role for non-social bees in Tasmanian agriculture? And I'll just say a few words about future prospects, just a bit of, I guess, blue sky gazing. So what are bees? Well, bees are a specialised group of wasps, unsurprisingly. They're derived from a very successful wasp lineage called the Specoids, which you'll probably be familiar with as wasps that hunt prey. So these include wasps like caterpillar hunters, spider hunters. Most backyards in Tasmania would support 3 or 4 different species. They often make mud nests. So if you have a brick house, you'll often see the mortar extended by mud into these tubular affairs that the wasp builds and packs with either dead spiders or dead caterpillars. So these are the Specoids. One particular group of Specoids, called the Crebronids, are actually very bee-like to look at. And a familiar one in Tasmania is this one here, Bembex furcata. It occurs on sandy soils, such as at Peter Morrell Reserve and along the coast. This one hunts flies, including blowflies and robber flies about the size of a bee or larger. And as I say, it looks rather like a bee in any case, but it nests in the soil. There's about 20,000 true bees worldwide. About 2,000 occur in Australia and just over 100 in Tasmania. So we've got about our fair share for our land area, I guess. They range in size from 2 millimetres to about 4 centimetres in size. But interestingly, social behaviour has evolved in Specoids only a handful of times. So there's 1 or 2 subfamilies of Specoids that are weakly social, and then sociality in the true bees has evolved a couple of times as well. Reaches its most spectacular expression, of course, in honeybees. So in the last 10 years, we've learned a lot about the origins of bees. It's been long suspected that bees might have diversified in the age of the eudicots, the higher flowering plants. So there's a lot of coevolution going on here. It's been suspected for some time. Bees have a reasonably good fossil record, and since around 2000 it's been possible to get quite good phylogenies based upon molecular data from their DNA. And so by constructing these phylogenies based upon total evidence sets, people have proposed that bees arose in the early Cretaceous around 140 million years ago, and that they differentiated into the modern bee groups during the Middle Cretaceous, with the most recent common ancestor perhaps around 120 million years ago. So you can see here, apart from the fact it's horribly complicated, here's the origin of bees here in the Cretaceous, and you can see that there's about half a dozen main lineages of bees. And these lineages evolved over a relatively short period in the late Cretaceous. You can see the true bees here, the apids, honeybees and their relatives. And the bees that are diverse in Tasmania are things like halictids, this blue group here, and coletids, their sister group. But we lack the more basal bees. So the diversification of both groups, both eudicot plants and bees, is thought to have been driven by the plant-pollinator relationship. So we can thank bees for the wonderful diversity of flowers that we all appreciate. So just a quick primer in flower morphology. So basically, flowers simply exist to lure bees and other insects, birds in some cases. And they have a fairly basic ground plan. So sitting on a calyx, usually some colourful petals, which form the corolla. They may be independent petals or fused in various ways. Subtending those are the stamens, the male part of the plant, of the flower, and then the female part here. So most flowers are hermaphrodite. They avoid self-pollinating by ripening different parts of the flower at different times. So many of them are protandrous. The male pollen is mature and ripe and ready to be dispersed before the female part, the stigma, becomes receptive. And they might only be a few days apart, but are sufficient to force outcrossing. So the vast majority of flowering plants are outcrossers. There are some that are not, but they're probably doomed to extinction, many of those, eventually, or sooner rather than later, I should say. So the proportion of animal-pollinated plants rises from an average of around 78% in the temperate zone to more than 90% in the tropics. Unsurprisingly, that's where bees are concentrated also in their diversity. And the global number of animal-pollinated angiosperms exceeds 300,000 from recent data, which is, again, nearly 90% of all flowering plants. And unsurprisingly, 3/4 of human fruit crops are insect-pollinated. It's a service we take for granted by and large. What's interesting, and something that emerged quite recently, is that that enormous diversity you see in flowers that's attractive to insects, such as shape and colour and scent, is quite commonly controlled by just a single gene. So for quite modest changes in genetic profiles, you can get quite dramatic changes in morphology of flowers. And so, unsurprisingly, plants are highly responsive to selection pressure coming at them from these potential different pollinators. So here's an example recently published in Petunia. You can have magenta-coloured flowers that attract bees, or white ones that release their scent at night that attract hawk moths, or red ones with deep nectar that attract hummingbirds. And you could line up many numerous examples of this in Australia too. One of my early students discovered that Cyathodes, which was widely thought to be completely insect-pollinated, which is one of the apacrids endemic to Tasmania, in fact is bird-pollinated, but you wouldn't think so to look at the flower unless you look at it very closely and realise that in fact it's pedunculate. It flowers in winter when bees aren't very active, and it has quite a large nectar flow that peaks at dawn. So on that basis she camped out on Mount Nelson here and actually got the evidence she needed to demonstrate that Cyathodes divaricata in fact is bird-pollinated. So is there an emerging pollination problem? Well, I checked on Google at lunchtime, and in fact 1.8 million hits tell me there is, led by Greenpeace. But Wikipedia features colony collapse disorder, which is a generic term that doesn't mean much. I guess it's fair to say that indeed there's certainly at least a general belief out there that there is indeed a crisis in honeybees. If that's the case, then we could be in serious trouble, because work by Klein and others suggested that if you added honeybees or pollinators, managed pollinators to crop plants, you generally got, in most cases, a significant increase of yield. In a few cases you got not much increase, but in only a very small minority did you get no response at all. So a number of recent review papers have been quite persuaded that indeed there is a crisis, certainly with honeybees in the Northern Hemisphere. And the potential drivers of loss include habitat loss and fragmentation, chemicals, pathogens, alien species, climate change and interactions. Just sort of the usual suspects, I suppose. So pollinator declines generally not only result in loss of pollination services, but they have important negative impacts that knock on to things like the wider ecosystem stability, food security and human welfare generally. A recent paper by Breeze and others this year, they state that declines in insect pollinators across Europe threaten the supply of services to agriculture generally. Ironically, EU policies, and particularly biofuel policies, have encouraged quite a big expansion in cultivated areas of insect-pollinated crops like canola, for example. But simultaneously, the requirement for pollination has been rising 5 times as fast as honeybee stocks. So basically, there's not enough honeybees, managed honeybees, to support demand in Europe. In fact, 90% of demand was not met. So this raises concerns about the capacity of many countries to cope with this decline. Simultaneously, there's losses in wild pollinators as well. That's the unmanaged bees. So together, that's creating a lot of misgiving. But the consensus seems to be that there's no single cause of this. There are multiple drivers interacting to deplete honeybee populations. So you've got things like environmental stresses, includes things like climate change, drought, insecticides. These days, most insecticides approved for use on crops are not acutely toxic necessarily to bees, but they do have sublethal effects that are often magnified in the hive. So bees, as they forage, get sublethal doses in the nectar that they sequester from the flowers, and then when they take that back to the hive and feed it to their young, it's the young that are dying. It's also shortening the lifespan of bees as well. There's pests and pathogens. So particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, there's a wide variety of pathogens that have been around for many, many years. These are slowly turning up now in the Southern Hemisphere, so things like Burrowing mite has colonised South America and Africa and parts of Asia. Its arrival in Australia is imminent. The small hive beetle is now on mainland Australia, but not yet in Tasmania. And there's also unknown pathogens out there too that take a toll but are not well understood. And then there's declines in genetic diversity of bees, of managed bees. So there's now a hunt to find often feral hives on remote islands. Places like Kangaroo Island have a pure Ligurian strain of bees that was very widespread in the 19th century in Europe and highly sought after because they're very placid bees. And there's now quite a lucrative market in supplying the world demand for that gene type. So these multiple stresses then, I guess, are summarised by this generic term of colony collapse disorder, which has been reported since the late 90s. But then new emerging threats include new synthetic insecticides like neonicotinoids, which are chemically related to nicotine. They're nerve poisons, highly efficient at what they do. But again, it becomes concentrated through the biology and behaviour of the social bees. Varroa mites come from a sort of a standing start in the last 30 years. No one's too sure quite where it originated, but it spread from bee to bee, breeds inside the nest, and can deplete the nest severely. It can also be managed to a certain degree. You can build excluders on hives. You can also breed bees that have better hygienic behaviour that shed the mite parasite. But of course, what people forget is that a great deal of pollination is actually mediated through feral honeybee hives, which can't be managed. And so if these decline, then that's an additional problem. So this is the Varroa mite here. It's only about 0.5 millimetre in size. And it's an external parasite on adult bee. And as I mentioned, the small hive beetle, again, is a fairly recent outbreak pest. It's gone around the world in about 20 years and has been in the mainland Australia for about a decade, I think. Good hard data is hard to come by, but it is out there. Here's some data report in 2010 monitoring changes in wild bees and hoverflies, which resemble bees and have a similar ecology, but they're not social, in Western Europe over a 30-year period. So this is plotted on a 10-kilometre grid. And of course, in places like Western Europe, these species are very well recognised, and there's lots of people recognise them by sight. And so in Britain, certainly, there's a very well organised centrally reporting capacity where this data is collated each year and fed to policymakers who often ignore it. But it's clear that bee diversity has declined in landscapes in both those countries in that 30-year period. However, hoverfly diversity has actually increased in some Dutch landscapes, and it's got both increases and local decreases in Britain. Reasons for this aren't very well understood. Hoverflies are predatory as larvae, so they thrive on aphid infestations and things like that. So it might be that a positive byproduct of intensification of agriculture might be that there's more aphids in the landscape and therefore more hoverflies as a result. Because they're not social, they don't tend to concentrate these low levels of neonicotinoids and other insecticides either. So they've got some behavioural, I guess, resilience against many agricultural practices that impact bees badly. So what about Tasmania? So what native bees occur here? Well, we've totaled up 101 species of bees with names that we can actually put a name to. These represent 4 of about 8 or 9 of the world's bee families. In addition, we've got several unnamed species that have often been known for some years, but no one's got around to giving them a formal name, haven't been described. And every year we find 1 or 2 extra bees, commonly of a mainland species that was probably here all the time, just unrecognised or not collected. So we're still accumulating species to our list. Remarkably, nearly half of them belong to one genus, Lasioglossum, which is a cosmopolitan genus of small, rather dull-looking bees, it must be said. It's a genus that occurs most continents, and in some parts of the world they're called sweat bees, because they, in the old days, when there was horse-drawn implements in farming, the bees used to go to horses and drink their sweat. I don't think they followed tractors to the same extent. And then the cletted bee genus Leoptus is the second largest with about 14 species. These are more specialised bees, rather more attractive to look at, brighter colours. But some of those are quite specialised on particular flowers like Proteaceae, for example. And we lack the eusocial bees, the truly social bees such as Trigona, which is a subtropical, tropical genus, goes right up through Asia. And Trigona is in fact managed. You can buy small hives of Trigona from specialist breeders, but it doesn't survive south of southern New South Wales, I don't think. So interestingly enough, the first bee ever described from Tasmania was the Banksia bee, which I saw some the other day down on the Banksias just out the door here. It's one of the largest bees in Tasmania, one of the prettiest. It's a metallic bluish black colour with a nice yellow face and yellow spots on the thorax here. The males are quite territorial. They sit on the top of the Banksia flowers and fight off all comers. And they've got a reasonably painful sting. One of the few native bees that we can actually feel the sting. Described by Erichsen, who was a German entomologist in Berlin in 1842, in a famous paper where he described many insects from war north, collected by Adolphus Scheier, who was a Prussian sheep expert sent out to assist the VDL company at that time. Interestingly enough, it wasn't the first bee collected in Tasmania. In fact, Charles Darwin collected a bee on the domain, or most likely on the domain, in 1836, where it languished in his collection till 1914, till an American called Cockerell found it, recognised it as a new species and described it. And unlike the Banksia bee, which is pretty much restricted to Banksia as a food and nectar source, this species, imitans, is quite catholic in its tastes. It takes pollen and nectar from quite a variety of plant families, including orchids. It's only a very small bee, about 3 millimetres in size, but it still lives in the domain to this day. Here's some other Lasioglossum. These two species here, Lenarium and Helichrysia, are interesting because they're probably the two most common and widespread and abundant Lasioglossum we've found so far. Lenarium's the largest of all the Lasioglossum in Tasmania. It grows to probably 6 millimetres, 7 millimetres, quite a robust bee. And it's recorded in 55 different plant genera, mostly natives. Whereas Helichrysia is slightly smaller and not quite as accepting of as many plant genera as a food source. But you can see they're rather dull to look at and frustratingly difficult to identify, some of them. But there's very subtle features in the shapes of the head and the sculpturing on the thorax. This one's rather more rugose than Lenarium. If you really get frustrated, you can dissect their top lip and magnify it, and there's subtle differences in the labrum or the top lip of the bee. And if that fails, and it's a male, you can look at his dick and you can see that they have different genitalia. That's only 0.5 millimetre in size. So you can see why there hasn't been much work done on Lasioglossum in Tasmania before, perhaps. But of course, the familiar honeybee has been here since the 1830s. It rapidly established feral populations in the state and was very important in the history of Tasmanian agriculture because the other industry, which got going in the early 1880s, was highly dependent on feral honeybee populations for its success. And to this day, that's generally true. I don't think there's reliable data on what proportion of the Tasmanian agricultural output is reliant on feral bees, but it would be very considerable. You'd be familiar with a honeybee, high degree of sociality, single queen. All of these are sterile females, full sisters, unusual genetics. Usually a single drone inseminates the queen, but new drones and new queens are produced most years, which leave the hive to establish daughter colonies elsewhere. But the life cycle is fairly stereotyped. It takes about 3 weeks to generate a new bee. The hives go dormant over the winter, and the adult bee spends half its life as a nurse raising its young sisters, and when she's middle-aged or early middle age, she leaves the hive and forages for nectar and pollen and dies at the age of 42 days. Interestingly, the closest relative to the social honeybee is this one, are the reed bees, or red-bodied bees, as they're sometimes called, Exonura, which we have about 4 species, I think. It's the closest relative to Apis. This thing is weakly social. Several females will often raise a brood in the same cavity in a hollow stem, and they sequentially provision the larvae. They'll bring food to them over a period. This bee is extremely common in Hobart, in gardens. Everyone will have it in their garden. It nests in hollows, in rose stems, blackberries, anything like that. And it overwinters as an adult. So if you were to split those stems now, you'd find the bees, adult bees, hunkered down inside the hollow. So can these native bees be managed, all 101 species? Well, it's hard to know, but we know a lot from work done elsewhere about solitary bees and locally native bees, and we know, for example, that they're sensitive to crop management. So there's been work done in other continents, North America in this case, relating bee abundance and seed production to different forms of agriculture, supporting canola. So in this study from 2005, they compared conventional to organic to genetically modified canola. And they could show that there was no pollination deficit in organic fields, but moderate level of shortfall in conventional fields and the largest deficit in GM fields, reflecting the relative abundance of bee activity. It's true for most plants, in fact, not just in agriculture, but generally, that the limiting factor in seed set is poor pollination transfer. Basically, they're pollen or pollinator limited. So by adding extra bees, or by bees being more active in these environments, the payoff usually is in much better seed set, often larger seeds or larger fruit as a result. And so there's a significant dividend to be had from keeping bees viable in these circumstances. So what are the management issues? Well, native bees have quite a variety of predators and parasites, but we don't know much about them. We see them in the environment quite a bit, but nobody's done any work on getting any quantifiable figures on what proportion of native bees they kill, or to what extent they might reduce their reproductive success. So they include things like chrysidid wasps. These are rather lovely wasps. They're called peacock wasps in other parts of the world, but they're quite common in Tasmania. You'll often see them sitting on sunlit tree trunks adjacent to bee burrows, the species that nest in tree hollows. And they're just waiting for the female bee to leave, and they go in and they parasitise the larvae. Gastrupian has a similar biology, but it uses its long ovipositor. It doesn't wait for the female bee to leave. It just pokes in this long ovipositor and lays an egg, stabs the larva, and lays an egg on it. So they could be relatively significant. Nobody knows. But the good thing about solitary bees, of course, is that they're immune to social bee diseases, things like Varroa and a whole range of viruses and bacteria, chalky brood, those sorts of things. So Lasioglossum and its relatives are solitary burrowing bees. They create burrows for the purpose of breeding. They're not very deep, typically 5 to maybe 15 centimetres, depending on how hard the soil is. They may be quite independently prepared, or sometimes you find them in little aggregations like this. There's no evidence of any cooperation between the females, but it might just be that that's a particularly favourable piece of soil in which to establish a nest. Some of the species defend the nest against things like ants or other potential predators for a few days before they leave it, and they'll often fill in the hole after they've left with a bit of loose soil. But in that hole will be a pollen ball, might be half the size of the bee, that's mixed with nectar to make a sticky mass, and the female bee lays an egg on that, and there's sufficient food there. It's provisioned with enough food for the larva to go right through its life cycle to become a bee some weeks or months later. Each female in Lasioglossum, elsewhere anyway, there's no data for Tasmania, but elsewhere they may produce half a dozen of these holes in a season. So they don't breed particularly quickly, but their needs in terms of nesting sites aren't particularly specialised. So one thing that emerges from this, of course, is that we do need to take care of nesting sites. They're not randomly distributed in the environment. They tend to be areas of often fairly compact soil, close to nectar and pollen sites, and they tend to be probably used repeatedly, probably have been for hundreds if not thousands of years, I suspect, by local colonies of bees. So here's a location in the Midlands where you've got nice clay soil that is very good for digging in for the bees' point of view, and previous visits was well pockmarked with Lasioglossum holes. If the local hoons decide to do some circle work there, then it can't be great for the bees, or their food plants for that matter. So native bees also need some other things. They need undisturbed patches of sunlit soil because they often like to sunbake. Being dark coloured, they heat up quite quickly in the mornings. I've seen bees sitting on the ground where they've probably been overnight and they're completely moribund from the cold overnight temperatures. But as soon as the sun comes on them, they warm quite quickly, and within an hour or two of sunrise, they're ready to fly. But locations which become overgrown through perhaps lack of burning or lack of disturbance that creates soil patches is probably to their disadvantage. So a good sort of variegated type small-scale landscapes are ideal for them. They need accessible nectar plants. As we saw with some of the Lasioglossum, they're not particularly attached to any particular plant. They'll take nectar from a wide variety, but these plants have to be in reasonable abundance, and there needs to be an extended nectar season over 6 to 8 months. The overwintering period in Tasmania is actually quite short, which might be a bit surprising for latitude, but you can find native bees active from mid-August. So some of the native peas, like Leoptus, that begin flowering at the end of winter, and some of the smaller Ericaceae that flower at that time, they attract plenty of bees on a sunny day in August. And so as long as there's a continuity of flowers coming on through the spring and summer, that will keep bees happy enough. And indeed in Tasmania, where you've got quite good altitudinal range, you'll get a nectar season going up the slopes in a regular fashion. So you'll often find bees that were foraging near sea level in the early spring are active in early December up in the mountains, on Mount Wellington, for example. So over the last few years, we've made notes on what nectar sources seem to be particularly important to bees, particularly in the Midlands area, and a few of them appear repeatedly. Prickly box, Berseria spinosa, is clearly a favourite resource for these bees. We've so far got 12 species of bees on Berseria, and I'm sure there are others we haven't got yet. Some bees like to forage very high up on nectar sources, on the tops of shrubs, and they're rather hard to catch or to observe. Banksia marginata is important too. Apart from Banksia bees, there's quite a few other native species tackle Banksia, including several that only go to Banksia as well. Bluebells are an important nectar source in autumn, in March, April, when not much else is flowering, at least in terms of natives. In the daisy line, Asteraceae, both herbaceous and woody shrubs are important. Asteraceae have got quite open flowers, as you probably know. They're not strongly selecting for any particular pollinator, so they're open to all comers, and bees certainly exploit that. But also, too, it's apparent that some exotic plants, dandelions, are also highly sought after by native bees. I should perhaps mention Fabaceae too. Most of the native legumes are bee pollinated. Then if you look at honeybees in Tasmania, particularly perhaps feral honeybees, again prickly box features largely. Banksia also. But gorse is an early flower, flowers in Tasmania from July, and although most honeybees are dormant in July, the first sunny days of August bring them out, and they're actively working the gorse. And of course, Eucryphia, leatherwood's very important, not only for bees but for beekeepers. Most of the profit in the industry statewide is mediated through leatherwood. If leatherwood honey didn't bring a premium in the market, a lot of apiaries would be non-viable economically in Tasmania. So farmers are highly reliant on good leatherwood seasons because it makes beekeepers viable. Bees also need other nesting resources, so the reed bees need these particular stems of a diameter from perhaps about 5 millimetres up to about 1 centimetre, but typically of plants that have a pithy centre that the bee can easily excavate. So as I mentioned before, rose bushes are very good, weigler, blackberry stems, these sorts of things. And they make a fairly cosy excavation. They lay eggs, and then the larvae grow. Because, as I say, these are sort of weakly social or semi-social. This might be the product of several females from the locality, but the female is unusual in that they provision the nest after the larvae have emerged as well. So there's a basic degree of care going on. Here's a bee egg here sitting on a pollen ball. Eggs in Europe do have a sting, but you probably wouldn't feel it. But they do have a rather hardened exterior to the rear of the abdomen, so they can actually plug the hole quite effectively to stop ants and rainfall going in. Here's some Lasioglossum nests in Tasmania. There's a pollen mass there. They have very elongate eggs. And then cavity nesters. This genus Hyleus, these are Cleft Bees, different family to Lasioglossum. Mostly small, but a few are large. Often called yellow-faced bees or masked bees. But these usually take over pre-existing cavities in wood. So when a tree dies and it gets attacked by boring beetles, or beetle borers I should say, that can excavate the timber, the wood, then they leave, they abandon it. These are then taken over by these cavity nesting bees. And that resource in the environment is probably used for many, many decades. So dead wood, and particularly standing dead wood, stags and old paddock trees are particularly important. So I've seen in the Midlands on a sunny day literally dozens of bees of half a dozen species just flying around the sun-bleached trunks as they provision their little nests in these hollows. So one of the unfortunate things is that with the intensification of agriculture, as people take out paddock trees to make it more amenable for pivot irrigators, you're losing some of these important breeding sites. So I'd put the proposition that many of these important nectar sources can in fact be easily conserved and even expanded in many areas. Banksia is a long-lived tree, probably lives for 100 years or more in favourable circumstances. Once it's established in the environment, it's pretty resilient. It self-sows from seed after fire. It's reasonably well dispersed. And there's still good numbers of Banksia around Tasmania, although there are places where it's becoming rare. So, for example, on the Hobart Domain, there's not many, I don't think I've seen many juvenile Banksias. The few that are there look to be very large, old, remnant trees that could do with replacement, I guess, of another generation. And then prickly box. By any measure, you would call this a bonanza nectar resource because on a sunny day around one of these Banksias in December, it's literally humming with insects and birds and what have you, wasps. It's a true magnet for all sorts of things, and it supplies abundant nutritious nectar and also pollen used by bees. It's as tough as nails. It'll often grow in poor soils. Due to grazing management history, in parts of Tasmania it's actually become even more abundant locally in some places. It's become thickened up to the extent that it's almost regarded as a weed in some circumstances, and you can see that in the Midlands. You'll see paddocks with very dense aggregations of prickly box. Farmers don't like it, partly because it can take over paddocks. Some varieties of it are very prickly, and the prickles can snag in wool. But on the other hand, it can offer shelter to stock in cold areas of the state. It supports lots of species, including this rather lovely butterfly that only feeds on prickly box as a caterpillar. And it also generates a premium honey that's much sought after. So I think we should reevaluate the merits of prickly box in the Midlands. Just from the Natural Values Atlas, they're both obviously widespread species, but locally, though, they are under some stress, as I say, just perhaps through lack of recruitment, through inappropriate management perhaps at the paddock scale. It's also worth pointing out that single origin honey brings a premium in the honey market, often a premium of 100%. You pay double for a single blend honey, a leatherwood or a prickly box or a Banksia honey. In fact, I know it's at Salamanca Place the other Saturday, prickly box honey was bringing the same price as leatherwood honey. And a lot of people prefer it. It's not always readily available. Even mead's made from it. I've not tasted it, but I'm sure it's good. So you could imagine then perhaps a happy amalgamation between specialist apiarists, perhaps, who are meeting a niche market, and farmers who might have, aggregations of prickly box in their back paddock that they were perhaps thinking of knocking over or poisoning. Likewise, it's certainly in other parts of the world, people are motivated to put extra artificial nesting sites into the landscape to assist bees, and these can be quite successful, certainly at a local scale. It's been done at the Botanic Gardens here in Hobart. Still in the early days of the experiment, but certainly bees do find these things. So do some other creatures too. Spiders, for example, often colonise them. But over time, on balance, bees certainly are benefited. Even something as crude as a bundle of offcuts here from a pruning, provided they've got a pithy centre, tied together a bit of wire and hung in a place out of the rain, perhaps under the eave of a house, will almost certainly attract reed bees in Tasmania. And so I was just thinking recently then about this Midlands water scheme, because this scheme, I guess, is the flagship policy of the government, has been for a few years now. There's a huge public investment, hundreds of millions of dollars in the infrastructure, as well as private investment from farmers. And it's going to have a dramatic change. It's going to create a dramatic change in the landscape and the ecology of the Midlands. So it's going to move from an open grazing environment to a much more intensive irrigated environment. So this clearly will have big implications for the native biota that live there. But one consequence of this, of course, is that we'll see a lot of high-value crops, such as canola and pasture seeds and vegetable seeds, lucerne, these sorts of things. And many of these do need pollination. And given the stresses on honeybees, the fact that I think the average age of apiarists is actually older than farmers, it's not necessarily an attractive pursuit for young people these days. So there's every likelihood that farmers will need to rely, at least to some degree, on pollination from both feral honeybees and native bees in those landscapes. So if you look on Google Earth, Tunbridge, I think, is the driest town in Tasmania. I recall about 20 years ago, it ran out of water. They had to truck water into Tunbridge for a few weeks. It's on the Blackman River. But certainly when I first came to Tasmania, this was almost all fairly hungry-looking grazing country. Now you can see it's heavily irrigated. It's very valuable. It's on high-quality soil, on basalts. And now that water's in that landscape, it's completely transformed. But there are native bees still persisting. So here at Tunbridge Township Lagoon, a little forgotten bit of native grassland that I think was in the original town boundary, and therefore not developed, is important for bees. Likewise, roadside strips, some of the old travelling stock routes to the highlands, retain native vegetation and other nectar sources like dandelions. And there's things like Besseria, prickly box on some of these rather rocky, steep, east-facing slopes here, which flower prolifically every year, I notice. So there's certainly the raw material there for, you would think, a potentially useful native bee population. So Tunbridge Township Lagoon is a fantastic little area. It's one of the last unmolested saline lakes in inland Tasmania. It's been full of water now for about the last 6 or 7 years since the droughts broke. It's rapidly evaporating, I should say. But on the east-facing slope here, on the basalts, it's got lovely kangaroo grassland with lots of herbaceous native species that flower prolifically every year. They're a bit of gorse as well. It's burned in frequently, but usefully, to keep the grass nice and open to the advantage of the flowering daisies and other things. So here's just sort of a random cross-section of a few visitors you would see if you went there one sunny day in late October, early November, say. So you'll see various Lasioglossum bees. These hundreds of tiny flowers that make up the central part of these Asteraceae, of course, flower sequentially in concentric circles. So they flower for a couple of days each, and the bees just sort of pollinate them sequentially as they go. Lots of native flies do, but they're far less systematic than bees are. These Bombaled flies, these are important parasites of cockchafer grubs, which can be something of a pest in the Midlands, although I have to say that I've never found more than about 1 in 1,000 larvae parasitised by this fly, but nevertheless. And then Crispedias, again, Lasioglossum bees, native beetles, and over the years I've had classes and students on sunny days just document what they can find. And we've got a visitor list exceeding 80 species, not just bees, but flies and other things too, active in that small grass, and it's only about 20 hectares, I think. But what's interesting around the Midlands is that the roadsides turn out to be quite rich as repositories of native bees, so that here's the sort of 25 metre odd wide margin on the road up to Interlaken from Tunbridge, and you can see the council slashes it sort of in two heights, and possibly sprays it, I'm not sure, but nevertheless several species of dandelions, Taxonomy, Hyperchirus, flourish here over many, many kilometres, and we do every few years we do these 50-metre transects, and the average number of bees is quite surprising. Averages around 4.5 for Lasioglossum per 50 metres. This would be sunny days in October, November. Homolictus, which is a smaller native bee, is quite a bit less common, and honeybees are much less common than Lasioglossum in this environment. So these bees are actually nesting in the little open patches of soil just here, and in these paddocks either side. In fact, here I think these are Bursarias. That's I think a giant old Banksia sitting there, and the old Porciflora eucalypts, which flower in the summertime. They also are a good pollen and nectar source, but there's just too few of them these days to make much difference, possibly. And you can get some semi-quantitative data as well by putting out little plastic coloured pans. We use white and blue and yellow, which differentially attract different species. And in an hour or two, you can get quite a nice little cross-section of the bee fauna. So so far we've got 10 species of halictids just from dandelions in Tasmania. Here's some of them here. You can see they're rather confusingly similar, but they are in fact distinct species. Here's Lenarium, close up. Here's Homolictus. Homolictus is a smaller bee, but it's got a lovely glossy pronotum there. So, in the last 5 minutes then, is there a role for non-social bees in agriculture? Well, evidence from elsewhere suggests possibly yes. So, because they're solitary, they're likely to be less vulnerable to diseases and chemicals. But also, there's evidence from elsewhere that natural and within farm biodiversity enhances productivity of commercial crops. So here's some data from a sunflower ecosystem in the United States, and here's the units here. Here's 10,000 flower units, and here's 100 flower visitors. So here's your flower visitors, here's your plants here, and you can and here's distance to natural habitat. So where you're close to natural habitat, you've got lots more flower visitors apart from honeybees, lots of native flies and bees. You've also got lots of extra plants, ruderal plants, volunteer plants in the crop as well, much more diversity, but much more visitation by honeybees compared to where you've got low diversity of ruderal flowers. And as you come away from the natural vegetation, you can see how the visitation rates drop off dramatically not only in terms of diversity of insects, but even in the activity of the honeybee, which is the most powerful flyer. Honeybees will forage for several kilometres beyond their hive. Some data here in the United States by economists who were able to demonstrate that native bees can double the value of production of watermelon relative to honeybees. So using a variety of economic jiggery-pokery there, they on average came up with about a 50%, or sorry, doubling, 100% increase in production. Honeybees also, honeybees were less efficient actually transferring pollen grains on average than native bees as well. Same sort of thing in almonds, synergistic effects between non-honeybees and honeybees in almonds. The other thing is that native bees collect pollen over a much bigger proportion of their body than honeybees do. So this is Lenarium from the Midlands. You can see completely covered in dandelion pollen. Whereas if that was a honeybee, it would have most of the pollen just in little pollen balls on its rear legs. They actually, if you observe their behaviour, they scrape off the pollen and stick it onto their pollen baskets. But native bees just sort of get down and dirty with the pollen and completely covered with it. So when they go to the next flower, they very efficiently transfer pollen. So future prospects, well, the good news then is that native bees still persist in many parts of rural Tasmania. Many of them are generalists in the flowers they visit. The technical term, that's polylactic. Interestingly, a large and seemingly resilient species such as Lenarium seems to maintain quite good populations in most areas we looked. And certainly a variety of native bees have adopted certain exotic plants, including annual weeds as nectar and pollen sources. It stands to reason that on-farm conservation of native vegetation should help preserve bees at the landscape level. But certainly I think there's a case for judicious planting of extra nectar sources to assist bees as well. And it might be the case that translocation of bees could assist, particularly these more polylactic species, which are not too fussy where they take nectar from. So farm planning should consider the needs of native bees at all scales. We need local inventories of native bees. We have very few of these. We need to know more about where they breed and the seasonality of the flowers they depend upon. We should probably alert councils to the fact that roadsides could serve very well as bee banks. It's a concept well understood in Britain and other parts of the Northern Hemisphere, where hedgerows and parts of paddocks are put aside as bee banks, but the idea is being slow to be picked up in Australia. It's probably the case that beekeepers could form useful alliances with certain farmers to gain access to premium honey varieties that would be supported on their farm. And crops such as flowering lucerne, which is a crop that would adapt very well to the Midlands under irrigation, could be used to boost native bees. It's a very good nectar and pollen supply. As, of course, it also enriches the soil with nitrogen as well, so it might be used as an agent for that purpose. So finally, you might then imagine a variegated and productive rural landscape in Tasmania that also conserves and exploits the natural diversity of plants and animals to improve and enhance functions such as pollination. So currently unproductive cleared land or degraded slopes could usefully be restored with nectar-rich plants to the benefit of the local farmers and nature conservation generally. And you might imagine that apiarists will not just sell their or rent their hives to farmers, but in fact they might, in addition, advise on native bee populations. That would seem to be a niche they might move into. I think we're probably some decades from managing native bees in a more commercial sense, but certainly I think useful advice can be given. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.